Wow. Okay, so we have been witness to an amazing moment of movement politics. After the police were videoed murdering George Floyd, a handcuffed suspect in their custody, the activist organization Black Lives Matter and other sympathetic groups and individuals took to the streets to protest. There was some rioting, looting, and vandalism, some violence at the hands of more militant or less disciplined members of the protest, or at least participants in the protest. At least in the beginning. However, eyewitness accounts and video footage reveals that most of the violence taking place in these protests was instigated by the police. No reasonable witness to this moment can make the claim there's nothing wrong with American policing. It's clear that not only is racism a structural element of American policing, but other factors like militarism, in-group primacy, and an us-against-them mentality that puts police solidarity before the public good are also significant components that need to be addressed. These structures are interconnected and self-reinforcing. This is not a matter of a few bad apples. There's just too many such apples to make that claim. Something is structurally wrong. So what is it? And what can we do about it? One suggestion being made by activists on the ground is defund the police. After all, if the police are literally victimizing people, perhaps it's time to come up with a different model of community control. On the other hand, as police officers and supporters of more traditional law and order point out, defunding police means you may have nobody to turn to in the event that you are victimized by criminals. So, what's the deal with this defund the police paradigm, and how can we get to a place where we can speak beyond the memes, beyond the finger pointing, and actually get to policy changes that make sense? First, let's get past some of the rhetoric swimming around regarding police, protesters, and Black Lives Matter. You don't have to be a radical leftist to participate in the Black Lives Matter-led movement or to support defunding the police. Yes, radical leftists do support this position, but you certainly don't have to be a Marxist or an anarchist to be offended by racism and police abuse of power. Nor do you have to be a racist or a racist cop to defend funding the police. Policing is an external social control, and many would argue that it is an important element of maintaining social stability and solidarity. The truth is that in most cases, citizen interactions with police go according to prescribed social scripts, legitimized by our society. People call the police when something's wrong, or maybe stop by police for traffic violations or other incidents. Often the police interact with people during the worst, most traumatic moments. That's not an easy job, but this interaction usually goes off without a hitch. According to the Cato Institute, most Americans, 64%, have a favorable opinion about the police. But policing is also an expression of power, and as such, there's the potential for abuse. In the United States, where attitudes on race are influenced by a long, brutal history of racist structures and social action, it should come as no surprise that the potential for police abuse increases when encounters involve African Americans or Hispanic individuals and communities. That same Cato report also shows that 40% of African Americans have a favorable opinion of the police. When we look at the data, we see clear and incontrovertible evidence that there's a racial bias that influences American policing and that we're not talking about just a few bad apples that need to be rooted out. Sociologists consider racism a structural problem in society, and there's plenty of evidence to support this. For example, a study conducted by Nicholas Rule at the University of Toronto shows that black men are often perceived as larger, more muscular, and more threatening than our white males of the same size. The study points out that this mistaken perception often forms the basis for justifying use of force against black suspects. These perceptions are incorporated into our society. How we're socialized and acculturated shapes how we perceive reality. This is social constructionism 101. Even black respondents perceive black males as larger and more muscular, though not necessarily more threatening or deserving of a forceful response. In 1968, sociologist Robert Merton published an important study called Discrimination in the American Creed. This study is critical for understanding the intersection of racism and policing. Merton developed a typology based on the assumption that people are either prejudiced or not prejudiced, and that they discriminate or do not discriminate. Merton found that though non-prejudiced people didn't discriminate, while prejudiced people did, he also found that there were examples of otherwise non-prejudiced people who did discriminate, and examples of people who were personally prejudiced who did not. The difference is the prevailing norms of the groups in which they participate. What Merton does here is decouple prejudice and discrimination. Yes, it is possible for non-racist people to discriminate based on race. Even black police officers can be induced to discriminate based on the norms of the larger department. Furthermore, it is also possible to convince otherwise prejudiced people to not act on their prejudices. Either way, Merton's study suggests that pointing a finger at someone and calling them racist isn't going to work. It's more complicated than that. Here's another point that needs to be made. The recent protests may have been catalyzed by the death of George Floyd and later of Breonna Taylor, but the protests are not about these deaths. Yes, we can all go down the list of unarmed black suspects who were murdered by police officers. Indeed, studies show that black men are more than twice as likely to be killed by police officers, and black men killed by police are twice as likely to have been unarmed than white suspects. But it's important to remember that these examples of police abuse are at one far end of the spectrum of abuse. For everyone killed by police officers, there may be hundreds or even thousands of incidents of less extreme abuse, ranging from racial profiling, driving while black, to unwarranted searches, to arrest for minor offenses. African Americans are more than twice as likely to be arrested for minor offenses than whites. A Justice Department study of Ferguson, Missouri found that it was policy to target black communities for increased fines and violations in order to raise revenues for the city. I learned the reality of this in college. Most of my friends and acquaintances in college were black. One day, an event that we were going to was canceled because a group of my friends never showed up. I learned that they were pulled over for speeding and they had to wait for their car to be searched. I was appalled to learn that this happened to them all the time. I was pulled over for speeding a lot, but never had my car searched. Worst case scenario for me was getting the ticket, which I almost always deserved. My friends, however, understood that when they were pulled over, they would be asked to step out of the car and sit on the curb, sometimes handcuffed, while a police officer, in at least one case a drug-sniffing dog, went through their car looking for drugs. No drugs were ever found. This anecdotal story is corroborated by a study done recently by Stanford University showing that black drivers were more likely to be pulled over than white drivers and that they were more subject to searches. A study published in the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review points out that this increased police scrutiny, along with perceptions of race, authority, and masculinity, increases the likelihood of police abuse of black suspects and arrest. This increased scrutiny and potential for abuse also delegitimizes the police in the eyes of black individuals and communities. The study points out that repeated negative interactions with the police may increase anger among suspects and increase their likelihood to assert their rights or flat out resist police authority. Let me illustrate with a little mental experiment that I often do at my sociology classes when discussing this topic. I'd offer this scenario. You're walking down the street when a random stranger approaches you and tells you to put your hands up against the wall and spread your legs. He's going to pat you down. How would you respond? You'd certainly not comply. You might resist. You might run away. Either way, you're probably not going up against that wall voluntarily. But what if that person identified themselves as a police officer? Okay, well, I, as a middle-aged, middle-class white male, am likely to comply. I'd be confused, maybe even angry, even scared, but I'd comply. Why? What's the difference between a police officer and some random guy on the street? It's symbolic legitimacy. I perceive that the police officer may be mistaken, but he has a legitimate authority to make the request. Furthermore, despite my anger or fear, I have a reasonable expectation that if I comply, I'm going to be okay. Maybe I'm going to be inconvenienced, maybe even arrested, but there's a process. I'll call my wife, she'll arrange an attorney. I have an outlet. And once this is done, assuming I didn't do anything wrong, I'll just chalk this up to a bad experience, a mistake on the part of the police. These things happen. But what if I don't perceive the police as legitimate authority? What if I see the police as abusive or exploitative? What if this is the 5th time I've been put up against that wall for no reason? Furthermore, what if I don't have a reasonable expectation that if I comply, I'll be okay? What if I have a reasonable expectation that I could still be beaten or even killed? Might I be more inclined to resist, to run? Furthermore, how do these interactions shape the approach taken by police officers and precinct policies? For instance, I'm a police officer and I approach a black suspect for what I perceive to be a reasonable cause. I may not be at all racist. I may feel that my rationale is perfectly legitimate. Furthermore, I've been socialized with a perception of black men as being potentially more dangerous than white men. How do my perceived interactions with black citizens, more dangerous, more likely to resist, shape my approach to interacting with black suspects, even if I'm not personally racist? After all, at the end of the day, I want to be safe and go home without injury. Am I going to be more assertive, more aggressive, even more violent? Now think about how this situation, one in which both participants feel a sense of threat and insecurity, influences the interaction overall. If the cop is more aggressive and assertive, this reinforces the presumption on the part of the suspect that he's not safe. If the suspect fails to comply, resists, or runs, this reinforces the belief on the part of the officer that black suspects are more risky. The stories that each then tells to their respective community about police abuse or black resistance only validates the underlying assumptions, increasing the likelihood that this pattern will be repeated, habituated, and, in sociological terms, reified or perceived as the natural way of things. When I was a counselor, we referred to such interactions as conflict cycles, when the actions of both sides of a conflict reinforce and escalate the conflict. In sociology, we can combine this concept of the conflict cycle with what's called the Thomas theorem. W.I. Thomas posited that what people perceive to be real becomes real in its consequences. In this case, the police perceive that black suspects are more dangerous than white suspects. They are therefore more assertive and aggressive when interacting with black suspects. Black citizens perceive police officers as abusive, racist, and violent, increasing the probability of resistance and noncompliance. The conflict cycle emerges as both perceptions reinforce each other. Looking at the interactions between police officers and black suspects in black organizations and black communities as conflict cycles, I think offers a framework for addressing the issue and formulating a solution. So, is defunding the police the solution? Or maybe increasing funding for black communities might create equity and empowerment. Perhaps some combination of both. The concept of defunding the police also requires some explanation. Yes, there are some activists and advocates who mean this literally. They literally want to shut down police departments and come up with other methods of dealing with social problems that are less subject to abuse and exploitation. They see crime in terms of poverty, segregation, and exclusion, and they're not wrong. Instead of a police presence, investing in social services and economic opportunities is a better investment in dealing with crime than is policing. There's something to be said about this. Ta-Nehisi Coates, in an interview with Ezra Klein, points out that, quote, if they want to know what a world looks like without police, all they have to do is look around them. Just ask white folks who are of some privilege, do you generally have encounters with the police? Coates points out that in many white communities, the police are rarely a presence. But sometimes they are. Sometimes you just have to call the police. So maybe completely defunding the police isn't such a good idea. Most advocates talking about defunding the police are really suggesting that funds for policing be reduced so it can be redirected in more meaningful and effective ways. So where do these problems between police departments and black communities and, to be fair, other communities of color come from? Unfortunately, there's a long history of racism in relation to police organizations. When we think of the evolution of American law enforcement, we often conjure images of the sheriffs and marshals of the Old West. Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp cleaning up Dodge City with a six-shooter in one hand and the law in the other. The Texas Rangers making it safe for merchants and school teachers to settle the frontier. Well, it should come as no surprise to any of my regular viewers that I'm going to say it's more complicated than that. Our view of the fabled lawman of the Old West is more than a bit romanticized. In most cases, such men were pretty brutal and without much accountability. They were often hired by town merchants to enforce public order and exclude undesirables than they were the impartial application of the law. Court systems in the Old West were not exactly reliable bastions of justice, and posses often looked more like organized mobs than responsible citizens serving the interests of the law. But this arrangement was a component of the history of American law enforcement. But most Americans didn't live in the Old West. For our purposes, we can look at two different paths of American policing, both of which are heavily grounded in racism, ethnocentrism, and corruption. The earliest such iterations of organized policing were the slave patrols, emerging as far back as the early 18th century. As the name suggests, slave patrols were designed to hunt down runaway slaves, squelch slave uprising, and intimidate slaves in order to keep them in their place. After the Civil War, erstwhile slave patrols evolved into police forces focused on enforcing black codes, Jim Crow laws, and segregation. But the most immediate predecessor to modern policing was the municipal police departments established in rapidly urbanizing cities, starting with Boston in the 1830s. These police departments were supported by the city's economic elite, not so much to enforce the law, but rather to enforce order. Cities were filling up with people recognized as dangerous classes, mostly poor immigrants and later African Americans escaping Jim Crow tendency in the South. Slums and poverty existed side by side with great wealth, with few falling in between. Alcohol was readily available, and young people who couldn't find work in the factories were often left to the streets. Municipal police existed specifically in the interests of the economic elite. Central to their mission was maintaining order for the good of commerce, as well as suppressing any uprisings among the laboring classes. According to Gary Potter at Eastern Kentucky University, the modern police force not only provided an organized, centralized body of men legally authorized to use force to maintain order, it also provided the illusion that this order was being maintained under the rule of law, not at the whim of those with economic power. This was an age of political machines and bagman politics. Corruption was insinuated into the very fabric of urban governance. In such an environment, the police became foot soldiers for corrupt politicians and the go-betweens of the political establishment and organized crime. According to Potter, quote, politicians ran or supervised gambling, prostitution, drug distribution, and racketeering. In fact, organized crime and the dominant political parties of American cities were one and the same. The police also participated in electoral fraud in order to preserve their political patrons in office. By the 20th century, however, there were massive immobilized calls for reform, often as a result of commissions set up to look into corruption and finding lots of it. President Hoover established the Wickersham Committee to look into crime and police effectiveness. This was the first federal government action in police reform. When the depth of police corruption was made public, cities often appointed reform-oriented commissioners and chiefs to clean up their departments. A number of reforms were put into place and to professionalize the police and to create a firewall between police precincts and political maneuvering. These reforms essentially built, brick by brick, the modern professional police force we see today. Some unseen consequences of these reforms, however, also emerged. First, by creating an often massive and authoritarian bureaucracy, police officers often felt disempowered. This encouraged the formation of police unions that did ultimately give police more say in their work environments. Secondly, these reforms tended to create a separation between the public and the police. This is especially problematic in poor minority communities where traditional norms encouraged an us-against-them mentality. Finally, the rationalization of the police combined with falling revenues in many police departments encouraged local authorities to tailorize the police. In other words, precincts were forced to find ways to do more police work with fewer resources. In the late 60s, police came under intense social scrutiny. Police forces were televised brutally putting down civil rights protests, including the violent attack against protesters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Riots broke out in black communities like Watts all over the nation, usually as a result of police abuse. Conflicts between the police and Vietnam War protesters often resulted in intense police violence. Then there was Chicago, 1968, when then Mayor Daley used the Chicago police to violently suppress protesters outside of the tempestuous Democratic National Convention. In 1968, Congress passed the Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. Among the provisions in the law was money dedicated to police forces for community outreach and improved relations. So when I was in elementary school, for instance, we all looked forward to a visit from Officer Friendly. Despite these uprisings resulting from police abuse, two movements in American society served to entrench and further empower the police, arguably at the expense of civil rights. In 1968, former Vice President Richard Nixon and the Republican Party ran a presidential campaign promising a return to law and order. The social upheaval playing out on television in the late 1960s was disconcerting to white middle-class Americans. They were attracted to this law and order message, and Richard Nixon was elected. In 1971, in accordance with his law and order platform, Richard Nixon launched the now notorious War on Drugs. Now, this war on drugs had racist undertones from the very beginning. In 1994, Nixon administration official John Ehrlichman confessed to journalist and author Dan Baum the underlying rationale for the war on drugs. According to Baum, Ehrlichman stated, quote, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Now, Ehrlichman is a noted liar, but the data on this does support his claim. The war on drugs has had a disproportionately destructive impact on people of color and their communities. Furthermore, according to Dr. Hannah Cooper of Emory University, police tactics in combating the war on drugs, like stop and frisk and the use of SWAT teams, quote, appear to increase police brutality even as they make little progress in reducing street-level drug activity. Another element to increase police power was the crime wave of the 1980s. This crime wave, especially among youth, was heavily publicized, playing out on the nightly news. Every night we heard about the latest shootings, gang wars, and other violent crimes. Our movies and television shows depicted urban hellscapes where people, especially white people, took their lives into their own hands upon entering. Furthermore, there didn't seem to be any end in sight. Movies like Escape from New York, Mad Max, and Blade Runner depicted dystopian futures where criminals controlled the streets, preying on the innocent. Time and again, the face of this crime wave was presented as young black males, portrayed most notably by Hillary Clinton as super predators. The association between young black males and violence was epitomized when the George H.W. Bush campaign put out its now infamous Willie Horton ad. Culturally, the only hope good law-abiding Americans had against these super predators was a thin blue line of police who could take the streets back if only they weren't handcuffed by short-sighted liberal policies protecting the criminals. This was personified in cultural representations of the rogue cop, like Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry, willing to undermine police regulations and even constitutional rights to wage a violent law against the thugs and psychopaths of the inner city. Or perhaps they were fed-up civilians like Charles Bronson in the Death Wish movies who armed themselves and brought the violence back to the victimizers. Under such social and cultural forces, the public was willing to forego constitutional protections, at least for those people, in order to get the criminals in line. It was in this cultural environment that President Clinton signed the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act that is credited or blamed as a breakthrough on tough-on-crime policies leading to increased policing and even incarceration for relatively minor offenses. Now, look, I recognize that this brief history is pretty lopsided. I really am focusing on the slimy underbelly of police history, and that's not entirely fair. I don't want to diminish the very real contributions made by principled police officers and lawmen who have sincere motives as they practice their profession. But this video is about identifying problems. So where do these problems come from? Again, it's complicated. Part of it has to do with how we define crime in the United States. American culture tends to emphasize individualism. The idea is that we're all a bunch of autonomous individuals making free decisions on our own. From this point of view, crime is simply something committed by criminals. If society sees crime as simply the action of people who are intrinsically criminal, the solutions for crime will emphasize targeting those individuals. And if a particular cohort, say African Americans or Hispanics, seems to show higher crime rates, it's because African Americans and Hispanics are simply more criminally inclined individuals, and it makes perfect sense to target these populations. The strategy that will be used in such a scenario is increased external social controls, like policing, the threat of incarceration, fines, surveillance, and criminal records that follow individuals through life and maintain a level of sanction, making it harder to satisfy life chances. The goal is to make the punishment severe enough that people will choose not to commit crimes. Of course, this doesn't work. First, if sociologists are correct and crime is a structural problem, and we are, then emphasizing personal sanction is focusing on the effect rather than the cause. Secondly, when power is asserted externally, there's often resistance to this intrusion of power. Individuals within communities targeted for increased policing may learn to accept the labels of criminality applied to them and even embrace and normalize those labels, especially if they see no other way to deal with this. They'll dedicate themselves to outsmarting the police, while police must then step up their game to outsmart or overpower the criminals. Again, a conflict cycle is born. Furthermore, identifying a community as being home to criminal individuals also means that that resources that might be available to help the people of these communities, namely jobs and schools, are more likely to be diverted elsewhere. After all, as a business owner, do you want to put your shop in the middle of a bunch of criminally inclined people? This further exacerbates the poverty and strain that encourages criminal behavior. Another element of this problem came with the introduction of broken windows theory into police policy. The idea behind broken windows theory is that small indications of normlessness in a community, like, say, the existence of broken windows or graffiti, led people to believe that there are no norms in that community and consequently lead to more extensive law breaking. This is a controversial theory, and the ins and outs I really don't want to spend time on here. Suffice it to say, however, that if you combine this theory with a presumption of individualism, the effect on policing is to more aggressively enforce sanction on individuals for low-level violations. Combine that with racism, and we should be able to predict that minorities will be disproportionately impacted by sanction for low-level offenses. And guess what? That's exactly what we see. African Americans are much more likely to be arrested for low-level offenses. It turns out that this policy of sanction for low-level offenses overlaps with a period in which municipalities were often struggling to balance budgets. Sanctions for low-level offenses often involved fines, so municipalities had an incentive to step up the number of fines levied against citizens. But you don't want to step up fines on your middle-class citizens because they have the resources to leave and go to a city where they won't face fines. So where does that leave you? Unfortunately, that leaves you fining the very people who are least able to pay, which in a twisted sense of bureaucratic reasoning is dealt with by, you guessed it, imposing more fines. Then comes the warrants. Then comes the jail time. Again, this can be described as a conflict cycle. Conflict cycles that play out in individual interactions between police and suspects of color. These interactions at the individual level, driven by norms and values at the structural level, have serious consequences for both police and black citizens. A history of racism and policies of increased scrutiny and sanction in black communities leads directly to a disconnect between the police and the communities they're expected to serve. Police in such communities are seen as the problem, not the solution. This is a problem. What we get is a situation in which black citizens and police officers develop an us-against-them mindset. At the community level, norms and values that encourage non-cooperation with the police predominate, including the labeling and shunning of those who cooperate with police investigations as narcs and snitches. At the police level, this manifests as a blue code of solidarity in which police officers help cover for each other, even when doing so violates the very ethics police officers are supposed to represent. This kind of dynamic is antithetical to policing in a democratic society. It's more aligned with police-state dynamics, or, as Chris Hayes describes in his book, A Colony and a Nation, colonial policing. Another consequence of our current discourse on crime and race is that police officers are often tasked with taking on greater and greater responsibilities for dealing with social problems, even social problems that are arguably not necessarily grounded in criminal justice. In the same statement quoted earlier, Ta-Nehisi Coates pointed out that we deploy the police for so much. We do it so easily and so casually and so habitually. This is corroborated by former Dallas police chief Charles H. Ramsey.
We're asking cops to do too much in this country. We are. We're just asking us to do too much. Every societal failure, we put it off on the cops to solve. Not enough mental health funding. Let the cop handle it. Not enough drug addiction funding. Let's give it to the cops. Here in Dallas, we got a loose dog problem. Let's have the cops chase loose dogs. Schools fail. Give it to the cops. 70% of the African community is being raised by single women. Let's give it to the cops to solve that as well. That's too much to ask. Policing was never meant to solve all those problems. And I just ask for other parts of our democracy, along with the free press, to help us and not put that burden all on law enforcement to resolve.
Without alternatives at our disposal, our default position when we see a crisis is to call the police. and the police respond by sending armed officers in to deal with situations that they're very often undertrained to deal with. Instead of dealing with crime and criminal activity, police officers are called in to deal with mental health issues, domestic disputes, substance abuse problems, minor delinquency, and all kinds of things that other more specifically trained people could handle better than police officers. Look at the killing of Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta earlier this year. The debate around his killing revolves around whether the officer in question was justified in shooting Brooks, who resisted arrest and was fleeing and aiming a spent taser at the officers. Were the officers responding to what they perceived to be an imminent threat? Perhaps, perhaps not. I would argue that in this case, we're debating the wrong issue. Rayshard Brooks was asleep or passed out in his car. He was at worst an annoyance and an inconvenience, not a threat to the community. When I watched the video from a counseling perspective, I knew that I could have gotten Rayshard Brooks home safely and maybe even helped him connect with agencies that could help him. From a law enforcement perspective, he was detained and the police tried to handcuff and arrest him. Brooks didn't need to be arrested. He needed help. Sending a counselor along with, or even in lieu of, an armed police officer would have had a better outcome. Another outcome on this emphasis on policing is a legacy of over-incarceration, yet another social issue that disproportionately impacts people of color. The United States has the highest incarceration rate of any nation in the world. 1 in 9 American men can expect to spend at least some time in prison, but for black men the number is 1 in 3. 1 in 3! That's insane! Over-incarceration has a cascading effect, especially in black communities. Those released from prison or other forms of incarceration are often subject to other forms of police control, such as probation or parole, subjecting them to even further scrutiny and increasing the likelihood of returning to prison, often for technical violations rather than new crimes. Individuals with a criminal record or under other forms of judicial control find it harder to find jobs while at the same time face barriers to social safety nets, especially with regard to housing. Often these records follow them for the rest of their lives, a de facto life sentence for often relatively minor crimes. Oh my God, Andosa, this is so much! I know, and that's why my videos are never 5 minutes long, and that's why I'm splitting this one in half. In the next video, we'll talk about some possible solutions to the structural problems in American policing.